The Elven Expeditionary Force Fire of Dragons has discovered what appears to be a dwarven mining operation in the heart of the mountains at the centre of the Bane. They've set up watch on the road leading south from it and have just spotted a dwarven company of infantry making their way northwards towards the mountains. Little does that dwarven company know that the woods ahead are filled with elvish archers. Yes, today on Dragon's Teeth, it's the latest Bane Wars update, and we're planning an ambush. Hi, I'm Rob Poyton. Thanks for joining me today, and we're on turn 7 of the Bane Wars campaign, and we've got our first confrontation, our first battle. Well, I say battle, this is going to be more of a skirmish. There's only a few units involved, but we think this could be the precedent to something much larger. So what I'm going to do today is play out the ambush. I'm going to relay the results back to the player, Steve, and then we're going to see what happens from there. I'll also let you know some of the other things that have been happening in the game, some of the good things and some issues that have arisen as well, because of course, as I said at the start of this, when you get into a campaign or anything like this, there are going to be things crop up that you had no idea of, and so you have to adapt on the go. Anyway, I'll talk about that at the end. First of all, let's look at the overall situation. So part of the Fire Elves force have gone deep in towards the centre of the Bane, and they've come to a large range of mountains, in the middle of which they've discovered this mining operation run by dwarves. Now, there only appears to be one or two routes in or out of this operation. The main one running to the south out of the mountains. There's a long road, there's a palisade fort blocking the pass into the mountains at one end, and the other end just goes off into the distance to the south. So the Elvish commander on the spot decided to keep watch on this road. There've been some carts and wagons going up and down, and they've just spied a dwarven unit of heavy infantry coming northwards up towards the palisade. So the Elven commander very bravely stepped out in front of this unit with a couple of spearmen behind him and attempted to negotiate. The negotiations didn't go very well, as you might expect, between elves and dwarves. So the commander has stepped back, the dwarves are continuing on, but they don't know that the woods ahead have got units of elvish troops in them, spearmen and archers. Furthermore, there's an even nastier surprise, because there's a couple of units of elvish heavy cavalry floating around as well. Now, because this was going to be quite a small battle, I thought I'd play it out here at the Dragon's Lair, and I'll tell Steve the results. Steve has kindly lent me some of his elven figures, so I'm going to use those today. The dwarves are being represented by some of my undead, so if the dwarves look a little bit thin and undernourished, you know why. Obviously, what we've got on the table here is just a few units. There's the rest of the elf advance force over off to one side of the table. There's the dwarves in their stockade at the north end of the table, and who knows what might be further down the road to the south. There's also more elvish units hastening their way. They're on a speed march to get here as quick as they can. So it's all brewing for potentially what could be quite a big battle, or perhaps even a sort of siege of this mining operation. Anyway, first of all, we've got to resolve this ambush and see how things go. Here's the table for today's action then, and of course we are using our fantastic battles rules. The only slight tweak is to some of the magic. We tweaked a few of the spells to give each of the tribes a bit of a more distinct flavour with their magic. So here's the situation. At the south end of the table we have our dwarf patrol. There's a dwarf hero leading them, and he's just been in negotiation with Prince Trojan of the Elves, commander of the Eagle Infantry. Those negotiations are broken down, so the dwarf is heading back to his unit, who are going to continue their advance along the road towards the palisade fort, which is at the other end. So the black curtains at the end there, that represents mountains. The road leads to a narrow pass, which is blocked by a palisade fort. And just up there we can see another dwarf unit have just come out of the palisade fort to investigate, because their patrol sounded the alarm. They blew a horn 3 times. So they're presumably going to be advancing south to see what's going on. Of course, what no one knows is we have a unit of elf spearmen and archers concealed in the woods. Now, I know on the tabletop they look very close and everything else, and the dwarf player would obviously know that these are there, unless we're using some sort of hidden movement mechanic. For the sake of the game today, we're presuming these are elves, they're in woods, they've had time to hide and set themselves up, they're hidden, at least until they open fire. But this is only part of this initial force. Also for the elves here, we have those 2 regiments of heavy cavalry. We've got the overall commander there, the archmage and his dragon. And then further up, this is the entry point for all of the elvish forces. This is where they've been coming on. They're sort of skirting around the edge of the mountains. They found a little bridge there over the river, and there we've got a unit of light cavalry as well. They're horse archers, and their orders are to basically harass anything coming along the road. In terms of stats, the dwarves have the racial trait of being doughty. They've got crossbows, and they're quite sort of heavy infantry. The elves have the racial trait of being fast. Of course, we've also got mounted with the furious charge. The knights also have the regeneration trait as well, which is going to be interesting. And of course, that unit of spear and bow have got the skilled shooting trait, and so have that cavalry unit as well. So they're fast and skilled shooters. Okay, so I'm just going to total up the number of characters we've got on the table, because so we've got the dwarf hero, we've got the elf prince, we've got the archmage over there and a couple of captains. I'll get the counters ready and then we shall start turn 1. Okay, so we've got everything set up. For the campaign purposes, we're not using the mishaps or the sort of pre-battle rules that we have in the main rule set there. We're just going straight in, because the campaign itself will provide for any mishaps or other odd events. So let's get our counters together. We've got 5 counters for the elves because they've got 4 command characters. We've got 3 counters for the dwarves because they've got 2 commanders. The first thing we start with is missile fire. Now the elves are not going to fire yet because they really want to wait for this unit to come right up to point blank range. There's no other missile fire going on. So we draw our first counter, and it's purple, so that's the dwarves. Well, they've only got 2 commanders to choose from, so we'll activate the dwarf hero here, and as far as he's concerned, his job is simply to get back up to the fort. Of course, he doesn't know anything about what is waiting for him here. So the dwarf movement is 3 base widths, or 12 centimetres, so they're just going to come straight up the road here, which of course brings them straight into the jaws of the trap. We normally put a counter by the activated character so we know that one's done, and then we can draw the next one. And now we've got the elves. Now, because of the turn sequence, these can't actually fire until next turn, but I'm going to activate our prince there just to move him out the way, just so you know, he doesn't want to get caught up in anything standing out there on his own, so to speak. So that's that movement. And the next one is elves again. So I think we're going to activate the heavy cavalry. So we could potentially activate one of the commanders here. I think we've got a captain, we've got the archmage, we've got another captain over with the horse archers. The dragon is here as well, of course. I think for the moment, because these are being held back to see what happens here, we'll activate the mage, but there's no orders, there's no movement. So our next counter is purple. So that's going to activate the dwarf unit to the north, and they're simply going to come down the road, 3 base widths. So that takes them to there. And of course, they're totally unaware of the forces waiting for them. I suppose for this type of game, when you've got 2 players, you can't do it with 1 player. You know, we might look at using some sort of hidden movement mechanism. Should be pretty easy to put in. So then the player being ambushed doesn't have to pretend, sort of thing. That might make it more interesting. But anyway, let's move on to our next counter. And it's green, it's another elf counter. In fact, both the dwarf units have moved, so we might as well just do the rest of the elves. As we said, the heavy cavalry are staying where they are, but here we'll activate the light cavalry. Now, they've got a movement of 6. So, their orders are to move out and sort of annoy the dwarves coming along the road. So 6 base widths is 24. That's going to bring them out quite a way here. So they might well just be in bow range at the start of the next turn. So there we go, that's everything moved. That's turn 1. So our turn begins with missile fire, and now the elves get to unleash. So I'm going to count these as 2 units because they're separate. We'll start here. Now these are skilled shooters, so at this range, well at any range, they've got a factor of 3, so that's 3 dice. I'll just run through the modifiers. I don't think any are going to apply here. Unit targeting an enemy's rear corner, well no. Target company has any of the following traits: giant, monstrous and mounted. No, they're foot troops. Target company has the skirmishers or swarm traits. No, they're a formed company. Target company is more than 50% within rough terrain or woods. No, they're on the open road. And target company is defending a linear terrain feature. No, again, they're open. They're in the open, they're on the road. So the dwarf defense is 5. So we roll 3 dice and we need 5s or 6s. And we get 1 hit. So the same procedure now, but here we have 2 companies. So that's 6 dice. And again, we're going to need 5s or 6s. 1, 2, 3. So there we are. That dwarf unit has suffered a loss of 4 to its resolve. So we put a counter there to note that down. Now their actual resolve total, because that's just 1 company on its own, is 5. So that unit is pretty much decimated within that first round of archery. So close range fire, from cover, ambush, total surprise, and that 1 company is virtually gone. Now remember that our dwarfish troops there are armed with crossbows, but if we look at the line of sight rules, we find that they have to have sort of line of contact from front corners to their target, which clearly they don't. If they'd have seen the elves last turn, they could have fired, but here, because of the position, they can't actually return fire. Poor old dwarves. That brings us into our activation then. And we start with the dwarves. Well, I think, given that they can't really shoot from that position, they've got a choice. Do they go forward or back, or do they come off the road and try and charge into the elves? I think we'll go for the latter, because normally the only way out of an ambush is to go sideways and fight into it. So I'm going to roll the dice to make the decision, because they don't know what's on each side. 1 to 3 they go left, 4 to 6 they go right, and we've rolled a 3. So these are going to turn slightly and charge into the elf unit there. I'm just going to move these trees out the way just to give us a little more space. Their movement is, as I said, they've got a movement of 3, so they're not particularly fast, but I think that gives them enough just to wheel there and come into contact and there's their hero as well. So we'll resolve that melee a little later on. Let's get through the rest of the activation first. And our next counter is the dwarves again. So let's head back up to the other end of the table. So given that they would have sighted the elf cavalry coming over onto their flank there, I think it's entirely reasonable for this unit to turn to face them and ready their crossbows. So again, they've got the movement of 3, which I think will give them enough effectively just to turn in place there, ready to meet any charge or whatever else might happen. And that's the dwarves. So I may as well just move the rest of the elves, no need to draw any more counters. So let's start with the cavalry there. By the way, they were just out of bow range at the start of the turn. So I think they're going to move into bow range, and they'll be ready to fire next turn. They may well take some return fire, but that's war. So as I said, they have a movement of 6 bases or 24. Let's bring them up to well, short range would be bringing them right in close to about here. Yeah. So let's keep them just in sort of longer range, because of course they've got the manoeuvrability to maybe even go past them round and that kind of thing next turn. Let's bring those to there, because I don't think they want to charge a unit of heavy infantry, but they certainly want to give them some missile fire. And our other units here, well, I think let's bring the heavy cavalry forward now out onto the road. That gives them the option of going right or left. Of course, there's no particular way this unit would know what was happening in the woods there. We'll say once they're out here they can see what's going on up the road. So let's advance these. These are moving 5, so they're slightly slower, so they're coming out 20. Let's bring the cavalry out to here, and we've got various captains and moving with them. We'll keep the archmage back here with the dragon. We'll keep the dragon in reserve for the moment. You know, perhaps we don't want to reveal him too early on, because of course this is being revealed not only to any dwarves on the table, but if any of those get back to the palisade, or perhaps it can even be seen from the palisade, then you know they know there's a dragon about. And we know how dwarves feel about dragons, don't we? So that's all the movement done. We're into the melee, and we've got the dwarves' last desperate charge here against the elves. That company has 2 dice, so let's just go through the modifiers. Well, they get a charge bonus of +1. There's no flank attack. They're not got any supporting units. They're fighting skirmishers, but they're not in the open. The attacking company is 50% or more within woods or a water feature. Well, they are. That's a penalty of 2 dice. And the defence value of the elves is 4. So the dwarves roll a 3. Absolutely no effect. Now, the elves get to respond, of course. The elves have a melee of 3, so they get 3 dice. Because they're missile troops, they get +1 dice for closing shots. That gives us 4 dice. They are skirmishers, but they're not in the open. And I think that's pretty much it, because they're in the woods, but they're not the attacking company. So, 4 dice, and as we said, the defence of the dwarves is 5. So 4 dice, and we need 5s or 6s. And we've rolled a 2, a 2, a 1, and a 6. So only 1 hit, but that is enough, unfortunately, to destroy the dwarf company. Now, when we say destroyed, because in Fantastic Battles there's no morale as such, units have a resolve factor. When we take casualties off, when we take numbers off of that, that doesn't necessarily mean that all of those dwarves are killed. It means that the company has lost a certain number of troops, but also its morale is shattered, so it ceases to be an effective unit on the battlefield. So it could be that half of them are dead and the rest have all scattered throughout the woods. They're going to try and flee and run away and everything else. This is a nice mechanic because it sort of does away with rolling for morale at the end. It's all encompassed in your casualties and everything else. And what it means in campaign terms is I can keep track of that, and then I can say, well, yes, that unit was scattered, but after the battle you can gather the survivors and you've still got maybe you know, half your company or left, or whatever it is. Now, if there was another dwarf company or unit within sight of that event, or within certain range of that event, and they saw their friends crumble, destroyed, run away, then they would lose some resolve. Generally, depending on various traits and characteristics. So in that way, one unit being destroyed or fleeing can have a negative effect on friendly units around it. So we don't have that. However, we do have our dwarven hero left there on his own. Now, because his unit's been destroyed, what we do now is we roll a couple of dice, and if we get 11 or 12, then he is destroyed with his unit. He goes down fighting. So let's do that now. And we've rolled a 7, so he does survive, but we remove him off the table. To all intents and purposes, that hero, that unit, has disappeared. They're gone. Now, of course, this does matter in a campaign setting because he's still alive. He has survived, so it could be he makes his way back to the fortress at the top. It could be he meets up with another unit somewhere, or he might even be off rallying his scattered troops. So we make a note of that. The dwarf hero, who as yet is a dwarf with no name, has survived. That brings us into turn 3, and of course we're going to start with missile fire, and we've got both units firing at each other here. Let's do the elves first. So these have the skilled shooting trait, so whatever the range is, they're on a 3. This is why they wanted to stay just out of short range, because it's the same for them, but hopefully their opponents will be on a slightly lower value for firing at sort of medium or long range. So it's 3 dice per company, so that's 6 dice. And let's check through our modifiers. Unit targeting enemy's rear, no. They're dwarves, they're not monstrous or mounted. They're not skirmishers, they're out in the open, they're not defending a linear feature. So this is a straight 6 dice, and remember our dwarves have a defence value of 5, so we're looking for 5s and 6s, and oh, we miss, all miss. Wow, the elves must be a little bit rusty. They've obviously not been keeping up their archery practice while they're out in the field. So the dwarves get to fire back. At this range with their crossbows, they're on 2 dice, so they've got 2 companies. 2 dice makes 4. We'll run through the modifiers. Now, their target is mounted, so they get +1 dice for that per company. So that's now 3 dice per company. The other thing is that whatever the defence value of their target, because they've got heavy crossbows, the defence value is counted as 4. As it turns out, the elves have a defence value of 4 anyway, so that doesn't really make any difference. So 4 5s and 6s for the dwarves. 1 2 3. They inflict the loss of 3 resolve points there. So let's just put a counter out for that. There we go. It's not every day you see that. Elves coming off worse in a missile contest with dwarves. That brings us into our next set of activation, and it's the elves. So I think we'll continue with the heavy cavalry, and we're going to move those out and up the road to see if we can outflank those dwarves. So this is going to involve a wheeling manoeuvre for the 2 units there. So we're going to keep one front corner stationary, and the other corner will move up to the full movement allowance, and then we'll see how we go. So as I say, these are moving 5, so that's 20. So in effect, that corner stays there, and this is going to wheel round sort of 20. So I think we've got enough there to get that sort of movement, and then that unit will also follow round. Of course our mages and characters can move pretty much as they will. So they're nicely lined up now. In a turn or two they're going to be on that dwarf unit. So let's draw another counter, and it's the dwarves. So here's a quandary now for that dwarf unit. Given the situation, do they stay where they are and face off against the elf cavalry? They did quite well last time, but you know, that cavalry unit has a total resolve of 8, so they're not even halfway there. It'll take maybe another turn or two if they get good dice rolls to do any real damage. In the meantime, they've got 2 regiments of heavy cavalry coming up the road. I don't think they're going to want to stand and fight them. So my gut feeling for the dwarves there, given that they've got a nice big palisade fort just behind them off the table, I think they're going to beat a retreat back up there. They're probably still going to take some missile fire as they go, but I think for them that's going to be preferable to being charged by that lot. And of course, well, they don't know the dragon's there yet, but you know, if that gets involved as well, then bye bye dwarves. So in order to do that, because they're facing this way, they've got to perform a wheel manoeuvre to turn 90 degrees and retreat back up the road. It's not ideal, they're leaving themselves quite open to attack. On the other hand, we don't know what reinforcements are waiting in the palisade fort up here, so it will be up to the elves whether they follow those up or not. But let's work that. So this corner is going to stay in place, and they're going to wheel around. They've got 3 base widths, they've got 12 centimetres, so I think that's going to bring them round to about there, and then they've got a couple of centimetres of movement. So I think if we do that, then we are about in the right place. Alright, so all the dwarf units have moved. The only dwarf unit has moved, so we might as well just let the elves move the rest. Well, in fact, it's just this unit to go anyway. I think what will happen here, because we've got the fort there, we don't know what is lurking behind the palisade, I think these will be content with moving in, taking another shot, and then disengaging. I think that will be the sensible thing for those to do. If they get engaged in a melee here and they get caught up, they can't withdraw. I know we've got the heavy cavalry coming up from the south, but we don't know what might be coming down from the north. So these are going to move across and just position themselves to get a parting shot. Again, they're not going to get within close range, so given that they've got a movement of 6 base widths, 24, I think it's fairly reasonable just to do that, and make sure we're just out of short range there. Okay, so that's the end of our movement. Okay, next movement, so we're on to our missile fire again, and I said the elves are going to get at least 1 parting shot in on those dwarfs. 3 dice, 3 attack dice per company, so that's 6 dice. Now they get 2 extra dice because they're attacking the rear, so that's 2, 4, 6, 8 dice. And even though they're shooting from the rear, the dwarves still have their defense value of 5, they're pretty tough, so it's 5s or 6s to hit. 1, 2, 3, I have to say, these elf archers have not been doing so well. 3 hits out of 8. So that's a loss of 3 resolve for the retreating dwarves, and their total resolve for that regiment is 10. So, you know, nothing too much to worry about there. Okay, so let's get into our movement, our activation. And the first thing we draw out is the elves. The heavy cavalry are going to be moving up the road. We'll bring those in first. And the second activation is the dwarves. Well, they're just going toot sweet forward. So that takes them up to here. They're virtually off the table, or certainly off the table at the beginning of the next turn. so then we might as well just move the rest of the elves. Now the elves have a decision. As I said, they can chase, but given that we're in sight of the palisade here, and that's a palisade fort bristling with beardy dwarves poking crossbows over the sharpened spikes, then perhaps the elves don't want to get too close. There could be larger pieces in there as well. There could be ballista or that sort of stuff. Who knows? Who knows? So I think the elves are going to have to be content with that last single shot at the fleeing dwarves, and then these will wheel back to join up with the rest of the cavalry. So there's our situation at the end of that encounter. The elves have got control of that road south now. That's the major route out of the dwarven stronghold. The cavalry are just flanking it there. We've still got the dragon concealed in the woods, and who knows what lurks, as I say, behind that palisade up the end there. Will the dwarves send bigger forces out to respond? Will they dig in for a siege? Obviously they don't know that there's more elf units on the way, but then the elves don't know whether there's more dwarf units or not on the way. Incidentally, you may be wondering why I'm playing the dwarves here. Well, it's simply because the fire elves are Steve's army, so that's a player character army, and the dwarves are a non-player character army, so as umpire I get to run those. If and when this turns into a bigger battle and we take it down to the club, then Steve will obviously be commanding his fire elves, and I'm sure one or two of the other people involved in the campaign will be happy to take on the role of the dwarves. The other thing we have to think of in terms of campaign is we had one dwarf unit completely gone there. So post-battle considerations, there are some rules in the Fantastic Battles rule set, of course, for campaigns. For scattered units, you roll 2d6 and consult the table. So I'm going to be looking at that, but incorporating some other ideas as well. In terms of heroes and captains and that sort of thing, you may remember I said about they were at certain levels, and if they did you know, really good actions during a battle, they might get promotions, they might go up levels. Well, I think here there was nothing particularly outstanding. In fact, that elf cavalry unit performed fairly poorly, I'd say, in terms of their shooting, so their captain might be getting a bit of a reprimand. Other than that, everything went well for the elves. They had no real trouble dispatching the dwarves in that ambush. So I think a good win for the elves, but nothing particularly outstanding. I'll relay all that back to Steve, and we'll see what decision he wants to take next. So there we go, our first Bane Wars battle. A small start, certainly, but you know, this is the first pebble that is the advanced sign of the incoming avalanche. And I have to say, with Steve and the Fire Elves, they've been very good. They've been searching and exploring in all directions. They've reached the centre of the Bane. They've reached down to the south. There's a little bit of stuff going on up in the north. And of course, on the way, they're finding different things. They're finding different items and other peoples and tribes and so on. So I mentioned at the start about some issues. There's been a couple of things. One is how the different players have moved. It's been very interesting. As I said, the Fire Elves are all over the place and fully in exploration mode, which is great because that is what the campaign is all about. We've got a couple of other armies that are sort of similar, maybe not quite as bold. They're still exploring. We've got one army that has barely really moved out of sight of their home border, of their start point, so there's not really much going on there. And then the main issue is I've got one army where the player has just given me one set of orders in 7 turns, so they've basically advanced a bit and then they've stopped and they've sat there for a few turns. So my feeling is with that, if I don't get any more orders from that player, I'm going to see if someone else wants to take over that army. I'll put a shout out. It's not too late for anyone else to join in at this stage because the player characters haven't really encountered each other yet to any significant degree. So, you know, it's easy to fit a new player in now. And it's a shame, but this is what happens when you organise things, of course. You never know what is going to crop up. Aside from that, the rules all seem to be working pretty well. I've adjusted a few little things on the fly, made a few little tweaks here and there, but the feedback is all good. The players are enjoying it, and I think this battle aside, we're probably only 1 or 2 turns away from 2 player character armies actually getting within sight of each other, getting within shouting distance, and perhaps getting within fisticuffs range. So, of course, we'll keep an eye on all that. I'll let you know how it's progressing. In the meantime, I always welcome your comments, questions and suggestions. If you've run a similar campaign, did you have similar issues with players? How did you resolve those? That would be good to hear any feedback you have as well. Okay, that's it for today. From the heart of the Banes, Elves versus Dwarves. Who knows what might happen next? Stay tuned.